This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. My name is Winifred Lewis, and I'm a professor in psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Westin, and I'm a lecturer in social psychology at Keele University in the United Kingdom.
Hello, I'm Zach, and I'm studying psychology in UQ.
And you remind me, Sarah, I should say that we're in Australia here, Zach and I. And I'm Canadian, as some people can hear from my accent, but I've been here 20 years. And so I guess the project that we're on here today is to make introductory videos for each of the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And in particular, right now, we're doing the video for chapter 33, and that's Biographical Consequences of Environmental Activism. And we're lucky enough to have one of the two authors here today, Dr. Sarah Vestergren. The other author is John Drury, who's also a British social psychologist. Zach, do you want to open the questions?
Yeah, sure. We'll start off with a very basic question. What is the correct definition of a biographical consequence?
So being a psychologist, for us, it's more about psychological change. And of course, that can have the framework of behavioral change. But it's something that changes you as a person. So either the way you see things, the way you understand things, or the way you do things, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a psychological and behavioral change.
And that was a distinction that you made in the chapter, isn't it? You talked about objective and subjective change. Can you just loop back and explain those terms as well? Yeah,
so what we found in a lot of protest campaigns that we've been looking at is that we can kind of divide the changes. So some changes are changes that are kind of subjective. So they are kind of within you. But then there's also the more outward looking changes, the objective ones that anyone else can see. So, for example, one of the campaigns we studied, I became vegan as being part of that campaign. And that's quite obvious to everyone.
And just following up on that, I know that in the approach that you presented in the chapter, there's really 4 dimensions of identity that can change. Can you take us through those 4 dimensions?
Yeah, sure. So what we theorize, so this is based a lot on Professor John Drury's work that he and his colleagues have been doing since, I think, late 1990s in developing these dynamic social identity models. So this builds on one of these models. The theory is called elaborated social identity model of our behavior. So based on that, we have a theory that we change the self. So it's a theory of the self and of self-change. And when we talk about that, we talk about 4 different dimensions in relation to the self. So you have identity content that will change. So this dimension relates to what it means to be, for example, an environmental activist. So when you start seeing yourself more as an activist, that also means that you take on board the values and the beliefs attributed to that kind of role, that identity. So maybe you'll start thinking, oh, this avocado has traveled all the way from Peru, therefore I won't buy it. Or maybe you'll change your use of plastics or fuel consumption. But we also see the dimension of boundaries, so identity boundaries. So we change in content, so who we are, but also who is part of us, right? And that also means who is part of them. So we start seeing the world and other people based on this kind of new identity or reassessed identity. So for example, we've seen how locals become part of an activist group. So from in the beginning being seen as us and them, they then all become us. So we start seeing the world in a new way, which also changes social relations. And of course, related to this is the third dimension. So relating to legitimacy or illegitimacy. So this relates to actions, so actions taken by us and actions taken by others. So when we start seeing ourselves as environmental activists, that also means that some actions are legitimate, others are not. And this, of course, is also always related to the context, right? So these dimensions are not static. They're kind of dynamic and ever-changing based on the context. But the fourth and last dimension is in relation to power. So there's a shift in our perception of what is possible action. And this, of course, is within the frame of other groups and the restraining action of the power of those groups. So often in protests, we have both the protesters and the police. So the police often are seen as that outgroup, that other power. And once activists start feeling like we're united, we're loads of people here, then we can topple the environment. Then start feeling empowered and feel like they can actually challenge that existing power relationships. So along these four identity-related dimensions, we theorize that all these more specific types of changes are related to these, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Zach, over to you.
Hi, I want to, so just like you mentioned that based on the content of the activists, so let's say they're into saving cows, they're more likely to become vegan, is that correct? All right, so
yeah,
will constant participation in this kind of activities cause them to have a more radical approach towards their behavior?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing we need to acknowledge here, right, is that not just because you go to a protest, say that you go to a protest tomorrow morning, right? So you go down to the city square and you're like, whoa, reduce the tax on dill or whatever. You're not going to go home and then be like, oh, I'm radical, I'm vegan. That's not really how it works. So it has more to do with this identity change, right? So the identity is always tied to that specific self-understanding. So in this chapter, we talk about environmental activists. So then it makes sense to become vegan because that can be an environmental choice. But it also makes sense to reduce fossil fuel, right? But say that you were part of an extreme right-wing group and you were going to protest immigration. It's not likely that you're going to go vegan because then the identity has different values, it has a different ideology. So all of these specific changes are tied to that specific identity. So even though we theorize that the framework is the same for all collective actions, we do think that the specific content differ. So becoming vegan or becoming more radical in your actions will depend on the content of that identity. So it's tied a lot to the first dimension.
If I come back to that point in a bit more detail, Sarah, I think you talk at some length in the chapter about how it's the relationships that people have with other groups and also with members of their own group that really affect those trajectories of identity change. Can you talk a little bit about that, like how relations between groups come into play and how that might lead to radical action or not?
Yeah, so we both in previous literature on all the way from back in the day and specifically on the 60s activists, we see that there's basically two processes that lead to these psychological changes or biographical consequences. So you have the intergroup relations. So when we say intergroup relations in this context, it usually means police. So when you're protesting, right? You're there with all your protesting friends or whatever. And you obviously see that you have the right to be there. This is an important cause. Then the police come and they often try to move you or try to disperse you. And in some cases, they've also used hard force. There are some examples, especially from the 60s, where they also shot protesters and things. So this is the intergroup context, right? When we have two, the police don't always shoot people, especially not in the UK, I should maybe say. But this intergroup, conflictual intergroup interaction often leads to you feeling like your own group is more united. So the police action often leads to your group becoming more united and also becoming more oppositional. So from maybe starting to think of the government as your enemy, you know, it's the government that are deciding these crap climate laws. Then the police come, and then all of a sudden the police is your main enemy. So this, the intergroup interaction is most likely making these psychological changes emerge more intensely or faster than if they weren't there, because they can also emerge without the intergroup. So by just, you know, having discussions and workshops and hanging out with other people that you share identity with.
And that's what we call those intra-group conversations, isn't it? It's when you're talking with other people about what's happening and about the power that you have and the legitimacy of actions and who you are as a group and who's in your group and who the enemy are.
Exactly. And also, of course, often in protests, well, the protests we hear about, because the protests we hear about are the ones where the police often are part of, and they, you know, turn into less non-violent. Because, you know, all protests start as non-violent protests, and then the social context changes during the way. But what we know is that there's also a lot going on that kind of intertwines the between group and within group processes. So one obviously affects the other. So once the police comes, then you start reassessing your social relations, and, you know, you become more oppositional, you become more united, which also then affects your in-group interaction, because then you expect more support, and, you know, you expect people to think like you and support your actions and maybe support taking on the police even more. So it's a very dynamic and ever-changing process.
And we've focused a lot on, I guess, so far on the conflictual aspect, but a lot of the biographical consequences that you highlight are really kind of positive experiences of growth and relationship building. So if I were to read off the extensive list of you know, changes that can happen to people after participating in protests, it does include you know, the potential to radicalize, but it also includes, for example, increased well-being, self-esteem, sense of belonging, sense of significance, cognitive flexibility and autonomy, gaining skills, gaining knowledge, and even career benefits. And this is all in the chapter you review research about this. So it's not just, you know, the hypothetical possibility, but demonstrated empirical changes. That doesn't happen all the time, though. Can you talk a little bit about what makes an activist experience more likely to be beneficial psychologically and for your biographical growth?
Yeah, so a lot of this has to do, of course, with the in-group interactions, what we call intra-group. And what happens is that you start feeling that you're supported, you start feeling that you're empowered because you're with these people. And it doesn't necessarily always have to be that people are physically there around you. It's more the perception of being part of it, the perception of sharing this with others. And that helps kind of build your self-esteem, and it helps you feel better. It also helps you feel like you can take on things. You know, I can do this. I'm, you know, I can try this. oh, someone needs to learn how to do this. Well, I'll do it, because, and I could do it in the campaign. I could run petitions. I could, start organizing things. So you can bring that with you to the outside of the campaign as well. And a lot of this comes from you feeling like you're part of something. You feeling like you're part of a shared identity. And, always feeling that you have support. The people will support you in thoughts and in actions. And of course, there's also evidence showing that the bigger the network size, the more likely you are to have these changes with you outside of the campaign, because that's also very related to the relations you have with others, whether or not these changes will stay with you. So say, for example, that you changing consumption, doing your part in this campaign, then you win or something, and you go on and you have to go back to work every day. So you're likely to still have these changes. You're likely to stay vegan or whatever your change was, if you still feel like you're part of that shared identity. So if you feel like you still have that social support, you're more likely to have these changes endure. Which I think in a wider space is a really important discussion to have in, if we need to change our behavior for the climate crisis, we need to understand how to make those changes stay.
Thank you, Sarah. Zach, do you want to ask a question or a comment as we close this?
According to what you said, as long as we maintain our perception, or as long as they maintain their perception of their inner groups or the groups that they were in beforehand, they will still maintain the same biographical consequences as beforehand, even if they are not part of the activities. Is that correct?
Yeah. So what we find both in previous literature, but also in our own studies, is that when people perceive themselves to continue to have that support, continue to be part of that, that also means that they still kind of see the world through their activist glasses, so they still keep those behaviors up, they still keep those values up, they still try to, basically the social becomes personal, right? So you take that with you in your personal life, and you still,
it was
keep that
interesting
identity alive.
Reading in your chapter that some studies had shown like consequences of participating in the 60s protests 30 years later in the 90s, positive consequences, and it's inspirational. Is there a final point you'd like to make, Sarah, about the chapter or the take-home messages that are important for people?
Well, I mean, first of all, read the chapter. That would be my first part. No, I think. So we talk a lot about all of these really good things, right? And I think it's important to talk about protests in a positive light, because media and politicians usually do the opposite, obviously for quite obvious reasons. So I think it's really important to talk about all of these positive dimensions, both for us as individuals, but also for how we can actually, be beneficial for society and, global awareness. But we also need to acknowledge that there is these positive changes. So, for example, gaining better self-esteem or, better physical and psychological well-being. That's not solely, for environmental campaigns. It happens in all types of campaigns. So as we talked a little bit about earlier, extreme right-wing, for example, they will also benefit from protesting. And I think we can't really shy away from that either. But yeah, I think the take-home message is that protesting is really good for you.
A wonderful message. Well, Zach, did you want to offer a final thought, or what are your impressions?
One more question though. So she did. You just mentioned that protest is beneficial. Yeah, but around the start of the chapter, there was this point which mentioned that it is suggested that participating in activism can strengthen relationships, but it also causes them to change their careers more often. So
That was interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
What's that about?
Yeah, so when so that also comes a lot from the 1960s. So obviously, we have to see everything in its kind of historical and social and cultural context, of course. And a lot of this was also related to changes in how we see, family life, what type of work a man should do, what type of work a woman should do or shouldn't do. So a lot of that also comes from you start seeing yourself as a social justice activist, and then maybe you'll move into more social work career steps rather than engineering.
At the time, it was most people would have really only one job. So what you're saying is, in that sense, the activists seemed to feel like they had options, whereas other people felt like they had kind of locked in a choice, just one choice that you would have for your whole career. Is that right?
Yeah, and I mean, you see new options and you see new possibilities. And we didn't have social. I can't say we because I wasn't even alive then. But there was no social media, so you kind of had the very narrow. And I think that is a big part of why. But we do find. I did find that some of the people I talked to as well changed their university. What they had as a major in university, they changed that to more environmental. So it still exists, but I think the number of changes was probably more radical back then than it is now. Now it's more like a changing focus, I think.
I appreciated your chapter heaps, Sarah. I mean, obviously that's no surprise because you and I have talked before many times, and in fact, we're meeting soon to collaborate on a special issue on outcomes of action. But what I think I appreciated most in the chapter is just being reminded of the positives of activism, as well as the kind of negative attention to violence and radicalization. There's also quite a lot of personal experience that most activists have of burnout and relationship stress. So maybe that's what you were talking about, Zach. It's like sometimes activism just means you have bickering in your family and, terrible conversations about politics. And it's just good to be reminded that the empirical data highlights the positives more than those negatives, even though the negatives can be very salient.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. No, I think that the positives outweighs the negatives.
Well, on that positive note, perhaps I'll thank you, Sarah Vestergren, for being here with us today. And thank you, Zach, for heroically coming in and being part of the interview as well. And I'll thank all of our viewers. Thank you for being with us. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.